Gita that occur in the 13th chapter, and they are similes, and so they're educational when you use metaphors and analogies. The purpose is to educate. They're a didactic tool. They're a way of teaching. And they hit a little bit differently. Similes in Sanskrit are called Shaka Chandra Nyaya, or the logic of the moon and the branch. Shaka means branch. Chandra means moon. Nyaya means logic. And so the logic of the moon and the branch. If you are telling someone where the moon is in the sky, and they're looking around and they can't see where it is, say to them, "Oh, you see that tree over there? Look in between the branches of the tree." And then they'll look in between the branches of the tree and they'll see the moon right there in between the branches of the tree. The moon is not actually in between the branches of the tree. The moon is whatever it is now. But the tree is close to you. It's in your own backyard. And when someone says, "Look at that tree," you know exactly where to look. And then you look up and you can see that the moon has, just the way it's resting in the sky, it looks to be in between the branches of the tree. So the tree is close to you. It's a referent point that you know. The moon is far away from you, and it's difficult to locate in the sky. And therefore you use something close to you to get your bearings on something which is far away from you. And that's the value of analogies. That's the value of metaphors. You know, if somebody says, you know what, somebody says, you know, what's that person like? What's that person like? And you say, oh, they're sweet as pie. They're sweet as pie. I mean, the person is not literally sweet. It's not like you lick the person and you get a sugar hit. But if you say they're sweet as pie, you mean they're affable, they're easy to get along with, they're kind-hearted. And so you can't possibly hope to define someone's personality completely by saying they're sweet as pie. But it's a figure of speech, and you're relating person A to thing B analogously. That's why when you say as, like, as, you're using a simile. And, you know, it does help. If you're in anxiety, I'm going to meet this person, what are they going to be like? Is it going to be a problem? And somebody says, no, they're sweet. Okay, that's one way of saying it. But what do you mean when you say they're sweet? No, they're sweet as pie. Okay, all right, now I feel comfortable. There's a sense in which an analogy hits a little different than anything else you might use in language. And it creates a certain comfort, and it creates a certain understanding that you might not get even by reading a psychologist's report. There's an ease of an analogy. There's an ease of a simile. There's an ease in when you compare something foreign, unknown, to something which is known, even though that comparison may be, to some extent, figurative. You know, what's he like? Oh, he's angry. Oh, he's angry? Yeah, thunderously angry. What do you mean when you say thunderously angry? I mean, he makes a lot of noise, but nothing actually happens. Because thunder could be, it's kind of a multivalent comparison. What does it mean when you say somebody's anger is thunderous? Does it mean they're loud? Thunderous could be violent. It might be scary. Could also mean loud but not of much consequence. Could also mean loud and indicative of a lightning strike, which does have some consequence. It's a bit enigmatic. And so it's not just that using an analogy by itself necessarily will automatically communicate to the person hearing the analogy exactly what it is it's intended. Sometimes it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. You know, if you were to say to somebody, how tenacious is he? And you were to respond back and say, like a dog holding onto a bone. The context of that conversation, the fact that you specifically asked about tenacity, the fact that then the comparison is made like a dog holding onto a bone, it's very clear what's intended. No further discussion is required. Sometimes, like with a thunderous anger example, it's enigmatic enough that it requires some further sentences to communicate. In any case, whether the analogy is easy to discern the meaning, or whether it's more enigmatic and there's several possible meanings, analogies like parables, like wisdom sayings, they hit a little differently. They hit a little differently than straight philosophy, or sometimes even the straight poetry. Although they're poetic devices, it's a particular type of poetic device. So Krishna uses a couple of similes here. There's different kinds of metaphors, and so the particular metaphor that Krishna is using here is a simile. It's also an analogy. And so there's two of them. And so I thought we'd go over them. They're not the easiest thing in the world to understand. It takes just a little bit of work, especially the second one. The first one is a little easier to understand than the second one. The second one takes a little more work. I'm going to give them to you guys real straight. We're going to go through and look at them. You know, I'm going to give you the language really cleanly, but then I want to see what we make of them. Yata is a correlative. Yata and tata. There it is, tata. These are correlatives. As much this, that much that. So when you see the word yata, tata, it means you're using an analogy, you're using these correlatives to create an analogous situation. That just as this is like this, so also with the other thing. We do this in English with, to some extent, we do this with conditional statements. If, then. But the correlatives communicate a little bit more than that. They communicate that as much as this is the situation, so also the other situation. Yata sarvagatam sukshmat akasham nopalipyate. As much as yata, due to its subtleness, sukshma, sukshmat, due to its subtleness, as much as the sky or space, as much as space, akash, due to its quality of being very subtle, saukshmat, goes everywhere, sarvagatam, but it's never contaminated, it's never befouled, na upalipyate. As much as space exists everywhere, but because of its nature, because of its unusual and special, subtle nature, space, despite being everywhere, is never contaminated. What does that mean? It's an unusual statement, isn't it? You know, absolute zero, I think, is like negative 400, and I want to say 432 degrees, but it might be a little bit different number. I can't remember the exact number. Negative 400 and some odd degrees. What's absolute zero?
I know it in Kelvin. Oh, it's Celsius. Minus 273.15, I think.
So you have to multiply that times 1.8.
Yeah.
That's 400 and some odd, somewhere in there. So absolute zero is negative 400 and some odd degrees Fahrenheit. But you never get to absolute zero anywhere in the universe. And there's a reason. You know what the reason is?
You can't pull all the energy out of anything.
You can't pull all the matter out of space. And so in space, it gets down to like really close to absolute zero, like negative 428 degrees, negative 430, but never quite absolute zero, because there's always particulates of matter in space, even if it's like a carbon atom every 10 feet. And that carbon atom retains heat from the nearby stars and therefore heats up that area slightly. But actual empty vacuum space doesn't hold any heat. It's the matter within the space that gets heated up. You follow? I'll get back to that in a second. You can also think about, for example, if there was a foul smell, like sulfur. Sulfur has a particularly nasty smell to it. So, even if you look at like black salt, which is not really used in the U.S. in our cuisine, but black salt is used quite a bit in India in cuisine, especially like if you get into Ayurveda, black salt is used quite a bit. But even separate from Ayurveda, even if you drink lemonade in India, lemonade generally in India is more like Gatorade, and they usually put a little bit of salt in it. And the particular type of salt they put in it is black salt. So there'll be some lemon will be in the drink, and then there'll be some sugar in the drink. Of course, there's water. And then they'll also put a little pinch of black salt. And black salt smells like sulfur. It has a nasty smell. Sometimes it's called a rotten egg smell. Well, I don't know what rotten eggs smell like, but I know the smell that's associated with being rotten eggs, and it's a sulfur smell. You know the you know what I'm talking about? That smell? It's a little something. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a little shocking. You get a glass of lemonade and you think maybe it's spoiled. Just like if you eat Corella, bitter melon, for the first time and you don't know. You might think it's like it's rotten or something like that. It's got such a bitterness to it. Okra, if it's poorly prepared, it gets real slimy. You don't prepare it right. You should prepare it extremely dry. Even then, it's a little slimy, but I guess it'd be like desert dry. Like if you cook it in the pan, you'll put a little bit of ghee or oil, and you'll fry it a little bit, and then you'll take the lid of the pan and you'll turn it upside down, and you put a little water in the lid of the pan, and maybe the steam just a little bit percolates down and gives it just a little tiny bit of moisture because okra, as soon as you touch it to water, it gets slimy. And so if you get okra that was poorly prepared, you think this must be rotten because it's like so gelatinous. Or if you get that kal namak, that black salt in your nimbu pani, your lemonade, and you don't know, you'll think there's something wrong with it. So you could imagine if you were in an area where there was large quantities of sulfur and it had this intense sulfuric smell. According to Paradise Lost by Milton, hell has that smell. Sulfur. The smell of hell. But the space where that sulfur is located, the space never gets contaminated by sulfur. If you were to remove the matter, the sulfur, the space doesn't get fundamentally contaminated. Rather, it's the matter that's in the space. You could even go further. You could say the particulates that make up air, just like the particles of matter that carry the heat of the sun, they might even retain some contamination. Just as the atoms of carbon or what have you will retain a little bit of the heat of the stars, and therefore you can never get to absolute zero in space. It's not the space that has that heat. It's rather matter within it. And so if you were to take all the air out of a particular area, a particular spatial area, then certainly the sulfur smell would be gone. Even if you could contaminate the air, the particulates that make up air, you follow? If you were to remove those, then certainly the space is not fundamentally contaminated. You follow that? That's the meaning of the statement. You require a little bit of thought to appreciate, and we're not even doing the analogy yet. Yata akasha, just as space, sokshma, because of its special subtle quality, that's really unlike anything else in this world. Space is unique. It has certain qualities that nothing else within the material world has. But because of its particular quality, its saukshma, its subtlety, saukshmat, from that subtleness, akash sarvagatam, it's everywhere, space is everywhere. But na upalipyate, it's never befouled, it's never besmeared, it's never contaminated. Tata, so also. Atma, astita dehe, so also the self is situated in the body. Tata atma, the self. Astita dehe, it's situated in the body. Na upalipyate sarvatra, but in no way is it ever contaminated. Just as space exists everywhere, but due to its subtlety, it can never be contaminated by any matter. Similarly, the soul situated in the body is never contaminated in any way. Can you appreciate the brilliance of this analogy? Nothing in the material world remains unaffected by its surroundings. Everything undergoes permutation. Everything is affected. So to say the soul is unaffected, although existing within this world, it's unique. It's a singularity. There's nothing else in this world that can claim that. Everything else does in fact get affected by its situation and surroundings. Think about it for a minute. Actually think about it. What in this world is unaffected by the things around it? There's only one thing, and that one thing is space, which somehow houses matter and energy, but is this accommodating principle which is not directly affected by the matter and energy that it houses. It's a brilliant analogy. Thousands of years ago, it still passes muster. It still is powerful. It still works. And just like there's that amazing phenomena with regard to space and everything else, so also the self exists within the body, but is never affected or contaminated by its apparent association with this world, because it is the ultimate subtle principle, and therefore it touches, but it doesn't mix. Good analogy, right? Just as this, so also that. And this is the way you really flesh out an analogy. The thing that they have in common, na upalipyate, they are not befouled. That's repeated twice to make it clear that that's the point they have in common. And the space is sarvagatam, it goes everywhere. And the soul is never befouled in any way, sarvatra. Sarvagatam and sarvatra. So the word sarva is repeated, na upalipyate, not befouled. That's also repeated. Then the terms which are not common, which are unique, the Atma and Akash, space and the self, those are articulated directly. And then the reason why they're not befouled or just besmirched or contaminated is because of their subtleness, their sokshmyat, from that quality of subtleness. It's a really good analogy. because it's describing something which most of the time you would think of as being a singularity. Namely, that there's something in this world that's not of this world. But it's finding a corollary that is within your realm of experience, that you can point to, that you can look to, that's actually investigatable just by straight empirical science, namely space. And it has the same unique feature, at least to a large extent. What do you think, Dhruv? Good analogy, right? Yeah. So the next one is a little more difficult. The next one is a little more enigmatic, and it requires a little bit more of an unpacking. So I'm going to share that one with you, and then I want you guys to unpack it. So really listen. That was the training wheel one. That was the model. That was an easy one. And now we're going to get to the one that actually requires a little bit of effort. Yata, just as. Prakasha yati eka kritsnam lokam imam ravi. Just as imam ravi, the sun. Prakashayati, it illumines. Lokam, kritsnam, it completely illuminates the world. Eka, it alone. Just as yata, the sun, imam ravi, completely illumines this world. Prakashayati kritsnam lokam. And it alone does that, ekaha. It alone has that power. Tata. So also. Chaitri prakashayati kritsnam chaitra. So also the self illumines completely the body. Just as the sun alone, imam ravi, entirely this world, prakashayati kritsnam lokam. So also tata, the chaitri, completely illuminates the chaitram. And this word chaitram and chaitri are important words, so I'm going to take a moment to explain them. Chaitram means field, just like the word Kurukshetra, field of the Kurus, as the famous holy place, just southwest of Rishikesh, northwest of Delhi. Chaitra means field. Chaitram is in the accusative, so anyway, chaitra means field. So there's a field, but the word field is used in the Gita, in this 13th chapter, repeatedly to refer to the body. And then there is Chaitri. Chaitri means the possessor of a field. Just like a yogi is someone who does yoga. Or a hasti is someone who possesses hasta, or a hand. What does hasti mean in Sanskrit? What does hasti mean? The elephant possesses an extra hand in the form of its trunk. So hasta means hand, and an elephant is called hasti because it has a hand. The extra one, its trunk. That's its defining feature, that extra wild hand it has. And so a yogi possesses yoga. They do yoga. So Chaitri possesses Chaitra. And so the body is the Chaitra, the field, And the Kshetri, the possessor of the field, is the self. This has been made clear elsewhere in this chapter. It's also commonly used in Sanskrit. Just like Dehi, the last verse said Deha, the body. And so the Dehi means the possessor of a body. Kshetra, Kshetri. So I just wanted you guys to get a feel for the Sanskrit. But we can translate it a little bit more easily to make it a little less complicated. So just as Yata, the sun alone, Imam Ravi Eka, is able to illuminate the entire world, Prakashayati Kritsnam Lokam, so also Tata, the possessor of the body, Kshetri, is able to completely illuminate Kritsnam Prakashayati, the body itself, Kshetram. So we have here another analogy where two things are being analogously referenced in relationship to one another. And the benefit of an analogy, again, is that it takes something which is far away and enigmatic, and it makes it more easy to understand by comparing it to something within your experience. So what is the thing that's within our experience, Parmesh?
The sunlight, the sun, receiving the sunlight from the sun.
We all have experience of the sun making the world intelligible and illuminating the world. Okay? And what is the thing that we are trying to wrap our head around and understand, Ryan? The self and its relationship to the body. And the self's relationship to the body is equated to the sun's relationship to the world, specifically with regard to its quality of being able to illuminate. That's right. Prakashayati. That's great. So how is the sun's ability to illuminate the world analogous to the self's ability to illuminate the body? That's the question. I'll ask it again. We now know the referent point that's in our experience is that the sun illuminates the world, and we know how the sun illuminates the world. It enables us to be able to see things. And perhaps there's other ways in which the sun illuminates the world. That's up to you guys to decide. And then we know that the self also illuminates the body in a similar way as the sun illuminates the world. And we have to figure out how the analogy of the sun helps us to better understand the more remote and difficult to understand relationship between the self and the body. So how is the self's relationship with the body analogous to the sun's relationship with the world? And specifically, how is the self's illumination of the body equivalent to or similar to the sun's illumination of the world? That's the question, Dhruv.
One point that comes to mind is
Loud.
One point that comes to mind is the all pervasiveness of both. The sun, when the sun comes up, the entire world is illuminated. You can almost see almost everywhere.
When the sun comes up, it illuminates as far as the eye can see, and then some. The entire world becomes illuminated. So also,
when the soul resides in the body, the entire body becomes animated and conscious.
and so now the world that's illuminated by the sun is now made smaller, and it becomes a single body. But just as the sun illuminates the whole world, the soul illuminates the whole body. Right? What do you think, Rupanugaji?
Brilliant.
Super brilliant. Do you see any fault with Dhruv's explanation? Does anybody see any fault with Dhruv's explanation?
Not a fault, but like a limitation of the explanation of the word illuminate, because sun illuminates the world, but how does you said like the illuminate is compared to consciousness here, but how do we correlate exactly illuminate to consciousness?
How is that not a fault?
It's not a fault, I would say like
How is it not a fault?
it's not a fault.
I think you are faulting Dhruv.
It's not a direct, it's not a literal comparison.
Wouldn't that be a fault in his explanation?
Yeah, we can take that as a limitation.
Then why would you say it's not a fault?
Because I know how to correlate it. But
Because you're Indian and you don't like to criticize people, even when you are. Let's go to a professor. Rupanuga Prabhu, you are a chair-holding professor at a major university. Would you consider that Paramesh has just unearthed a fault in Dhruv's explanation?
I'm also an Indian,
Dhruv was born here. Is he faulting your explanation? Yeah. See? It's something I like about just a straight American. He can just say yes, nod his head yes. It doesn't have to be. He can be very direct. The self animates the body. The sun illuminates the world. The sun makes the world visible. The self animates the body and gives life to it. That would appear to be a difference in what the sun does versus what the self does. You want to defend Dhruv? You're ready to defend yourself, right? But just to move around the room, please defend Dhruv.
The sun does animate the world. The world would not be the world without the sun.
Sun creates photosynthesis. Photosynthesis creates the possibility of life. Therefore, the sun, in some sense, does animate the world. Fair enough. I would just then adjust my critique and say it's still not directly animating. That's a fairly indirect process of photosynthesis, which may be remotely responsible for biogenesis or the creation of life, but is certainly not directly involved in animation the same way, in the same straightforward way, that the consciousness's existence within the body animates the body directly and immediately. And photosynthesis, along with the water cycle and so many other things, and so many things are responsible for life on this planet. And it's one of many factors, but it's not the singular factor. The same way the soul's presence in the body is the singular factor which animates the body. And you're now stumped, right? Okay. You still want to go?
Mine was in a very similar vein.
Okay. Who wants to defend Dhruv? Rupanugaji? You follow my critique?
I follow the critique, I also follow what he says.
And you follow my rejoinder to her rebuttal, right? Do you have any comment?
My comment is that it's right there.
So you're supporting me now.
I'm supporting you.
But that's no good. I'm looking for people to defend him, not support me. I can support myself. I don't require assistance. I require Dhruv needs help. I'm okay. You want to say something? Then don't do like a little, I don't know what that is. Raise your hand or something. She did this. She went, like, I don't know what that was. Like, it was like some little code.
Sorry.
Let's go ahead.
It's not exactly the same in analogies. So it's similar, it's not precisely the same.
If it was exactly the same, there would be no didactic value in the analogy. Analogies are teaching tools because they approximate and compare some salient features, but we should never expect an analogy to be an exact fit, because if it was an exact fit, it wouldn't be something easy for you to compare something difficult to. It would just be that difficult thing, another instance of that difficult thing. Therefore, yes, you are 100% correct that the self illuminates or animates the body in a way which is not exactly the same as how the sun illuminates the world. But it helps you wrap your head around it a little bit. It helps you appreciate. So the body is dependent on the self. It helps you to appreciate that remotely the sun animates the world and directly the self animates the body. And that's enough. Analogies don't have to be perfect. In fact, by pointing out some small way in which my analogy falls short, you've tacitly admitted that my analogy is largely successful, because for the most part, it's good, and you have to find some microscopic small thing that's a critique, and that means debating what I was trying to communicate. Did you follow that? Rupanuga, did you follow that? We shouldn't be intimidated by the fact that someone can critique an analogy on some level. They're designed to not be perfect. Their value, as I mentioned at the beginning of class, is their immediacy, because they relate to something you have a lot of experience with and help you to then springboard and understand something you have less experience with. The sun allows us to know the world. Consciousness allows us to know the body or other bodies, or to know the world. The way the sun illuminates the world, the self illuminates the body and enables that body to then be used to understand and make sense out of the world. There's all sorts of comparisons you could make. But I guess the last thing I want to say before we wrap it up is that I think Krishna's surgical usage of analogies at various points in the largely philosophical treatise of the Gita is nothing short of brilliant. An expertly placed analogy is incredibly valuable in helping you to deeply understand a subject by engaging with that subject on a number of different levels. And just like Shakespeare has something valuable to say about love that you won't get by reading a science book about dopamine and prolactin and oxytocin and pair bonding and social versus romantic pair bonding, and there's things Shakespeare contributes to a discussion on love. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. It's like a wonderful statement about the innate vulnerability of love, that it creates the possibility of loss, that takes a risk, that's never a sure thing, if only because the person could die. What to speak of when people betray you in real time. If a parent dies when the child's very young, the child will experience that death as being a betrayal and an abandonment, even though logically the parent died. They had no choice in the matter. But for the child who's very, very young, they can't process like that. They can't understand such large conflicts. They just know they were left and abandoned. And even though they grow up and they understand their parent couldn't do anything about it, on an emotional level, that wound remains. It's not that everything we understand merely through logic. And so there's a different feel to analogies. And when they're used appropriately, especially if you're in a real terse, dense philosophical treatise, and you're discussing something in really strong philosophical language, which is what the 13th chapter does, to finish with a couple of well-placed analogies, it's just expert teaching. Krishna is an expert teacher. And so we can look over these one more time, and then we'll wrap it up. Yata, just as Akash, space, due to its extreme subtleness, Sokshmyat, goes everywhere, Sarvagatam, but never becomes contaminated, Na upalipyate. So also Tata, the self, Atma, is able to exist, Asita, within the body, Dehe, but never become contaminated, Na upalipyate. And we look at the nature of space, which accommodates but possesses nothing. And actually, the reason why we never get to absolute zero in space is because there's always some matter to hold light and heat, therefore. But if you were to actually remove all matter entirely from space, it would be at absolute zero because it has nothing. There's nothing for the sun to heat up. It could be right next to a star and there would be nothing there. It would be a negative 450 degrees approximately, 430 degrees, whatever it is, even though it was right next to the sun, because it's only the atoms that are heated up, not the space itself. Space is miraculous in this world. There's nothing like it. And Krishna manages to pull that out thousands of years ago. This unbelievably brilliant feature of the world that you can look at and investigate empirically, and then compares it to the nature of the self, which never touches the body, although it occupies the body. Like a lotus which is in the water but dry. Like a lotus which you can put water on, but the water just wicks off the lotus because of the structure of its leaves, which is completely repellent. And then a second analogy, which is a little more ambitious, because there are different ways to interpret it. Just as Yata, the sun, Imam Ravi, alone, Eka, is able to illuminate Prakashayati, the entire world, Kritsnam Lokam, so also Tata, the possessor of the body, Chaitri, is able to illuminate Prakashayati, the entire body, Kritsnam Chaitram. And that tells us that just as the sun lights up the world, the self lights up the body. Just as the sun makes the whole world intelligible, so also an awareness of the entire body is brought by the self alone. Just as the sun makes knowledge in this world possible, because you can see things and investigate them, so also the self makes knowledge possible within this world for the soul occupying a body. Now the body can be used to acquire knowledge, and so on and so forth. All the different ways in which the sun is responsible for life through photogenesis, and similarly the self is responsible for the animation of the body. And you can just swap out illumines for animates. You can talk about remote versus direct. You can show some indirect, kind of non-linear ways in which the ideas are comparable. And you're not locked in to just one reading. But there's a number of them, and it's actually almost meditational. You can meditate on. What a beautiful idea. How dependent we are on the sun. How dependent the body is on the self. All life would die without a sun. And in fact, the body without a soul to animate it is nothing more than a corpse. And just the meanings, they come, and they're thought-provoking. And amazingly, they're as thought-provoking today as they were thousands of years ago, when Krishna gave these well-placed analogies to augment and solidify and galvanize his largely philosophical teaching to Arjuna. And again, analogies are incredible. They're Shaka, Chandra, Nyaya. The logic of the moon and the branch. The moon is far away, and when someone doesn't know how to find the moon in the sky, you tell them, you know the tree in your backyard? Yeah. Okay, look in between the branches. Oh, there it is. And you compare something far away, more difficult to understand, to something close to you. And it acts as a springboard, which allows you to launch yourself into a deeper understanding. Not limited by the thing next to you, but you use it as a springboard, always intending to even go beyond that information. It's never a direct, simple comparison. There's always something more. You're always stretching your mind through the analogy to try to grasp a hold of something which is further away and more intrinsically difficult to fathom. But you use as a stepping stone things within your frame of reference. So I really appreciate Krishna's expert usage of metaphors. I think about these things. I think about the metaphors. When you first study something, you just got to get through the broad strokes of it. The metaphors actually become problematic. You just want a solid understanding of it. It's like if you're studying jiu-jitsu, you see the basic mechanics of the move. You don't have the bandwidth to appreciate the subtleties of a given technique, of a given teaching. You're trying to just play the basic chords of a song. You can't appreciate the subtle breaking of rhythm that actually makes the song sound better. But then as you go back again and again, someday you stop and you say, let me look at it. Just like when you first read the Bhagavatam, the 335 chapters of the Bhagavatam with its 14,000 verses, our magnum opus, our most sacred of scriptures. You just want to learn the basic stories. So you kind of skip over all the prayers, which seem largely repetitive and extremely dense and difficult to unpack and complicated. So you just read the basic structure of the stories. Who is Daksha? Who is Sati? Who is Shiva? How did that whole thing go down? Who are the Prachetas? Who's Prachina Barhi? You're kind of just figuring out the basic players of the game, the basic script, the basic plot. You almost are better off reading Amar Chitrakeeta. It's almost easier. It gives you the basics of the story without any of the deep philosophy. But then someday you go back and you read Dhruv Maharaj's prayers. And they're beautiful. And you just sit with the prayers. And there's a beauty to them. And his story is it perfectly gives rise to his prayers, and his story and his lessons he's learned are perfectly encapsulated within his prayers. And now that you know the story, you can appreciate the prayers and how intimately they're linked to his story. And how his prayers are different than Prahlad Maharaj's prayers. And how each one of their prayers represents their own life experience in relationship with the Lord. But that's at a later date. It's like a graduate level of study. I also feel like these analogies of the Gita, you might miss them in a cursory reading of the text. What do you think, Rupanugaji? You could, right? You read them, you think you understand them, you skip over them, right? But later on, once you, I don't want to say master, but once you have some degree of familiarity and some deep awareness of the major lessons of the Gita, you go back and you look at these analogies or the epithets used by Krishna to refer to Arjuna and vice versa, the names they use for one another, and they become pregnant and profound and worthy of sitting with and meditating on. I want to try to share that a little bit with you guys today. Thank you very much. Let's do some kirtan. Hare Krishna.